Hey everyone, Eric on paper here, and in case you hadn't figured it out, I'm Eric. So today we're going to be drawing and inking Deadpool. I couldn't get a video of the drawing of Deadpool because I did this drawing getting an infusion, and I get one about every 8 weeks for my Crohn's disease, so this is one of my special infusion drawings. I try to do one every time I have to visit. So believe it or not, hospitals don't want you to bring art studios with you. When I got home, I had to correct certain elements of this drawing, such as the shape of the arms, position of the katana, and the head size. I didn't have any reference material on me. And once that was corrected, I went to inks, and we can talk about some tips and tricks there. So whenever I go to inks, one of the first things I do is ink the face because getting the expression of the character is crucial. I mean, it's what sets them apart. Otherwise, you're just drawing a neat costume. And to get the inks just right, I use the smallest micron, the .005, to try to get as many details as possible. And you're going to see me flipping the page around a lot. That's because you want to conform whatever canvas you're working on to go with the stroke of your hand and not have to fight the paper or fight the tool that you're using. Another thing I wanted to bring up just with this drawing is trying to make a two-dimensional surface like a piece of paper, giving your illustration the illusion of 3D. And one way you can do that is by using multiple image planes. For instance, the katana that he's not using is in the back of him. That's our furthest plane. And in front of that is the katana that Deadpool has pulled out. And in front of that would be his body, like with the arm, torso, and everything like that. Then his head is the next image plane popping out in front of all the others, which is why you can't see his neck in this drawing. And finally, in front of all that are his knees. I imagine this pose like he was flipping and or going into some kind of like gymnastic move. I am obviously not a gymnast, and any attempts to document this would result in my death, but a really hilarious YouTube video. Probably get more likes than anything I do. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially when inking a character like Deadpool, is that the version that I'm doing is based around the film costume, sort of an amalgam of 1 and 2. I just picked and choose certain details that I liked, but he has a variety of textures on him. And in your inks, you're going to have to render out each of these textures and make them stand apart from each other, which is why in the area around the eyes, I'm trying to give it that sheen, and I'm doing that by making the lines on the inside a little bit jagged, but most of the detail actually comes from not inking the piece. I mean, leaving highlights wherever there would be a natural light falling on it or just a reflection off the material itself. Now we're going to go into an extremely sped up version, i.e. the speed I wish I could ink. So I'm using the 005 as much as I can, getting in as many details, but if you really want to make your pieces pop and get more of that third dimension effect, start playing around with line weights. Like around Deadpool's head, I am using the 03 micron, and I do that to help the head pop out because thicker lines read closer to the eye. And even here with the uniform detailing, I switched to a 01 micron so that it will pop out, but not nearly as much as the rest of the figure. Now, in terms of rendering and adding blacks to a figure, I typically don't fill in areas like this with pen. I try to use brush markers or other things like that, but if I wanted to really fine detail and feathering, I would do what I just did and go in. Now, when you're placing your lines like around Deadpool's arm here, you want a line variant. In this case, I like to start my lines thicker and have them thin out and then get thicker towards the end. And where I decide to place it is where the light falls. For example, the closer to the light source an object is, the thinner the line, which is why I use heavier lines on the underside of Deadpool's elbow and upper arm. Now, inking here where I know there's going to be a lot of shadow and detailing, I try to use thinner lines there as well, because if it's just too thick in an area that's already in heavy shadow, you're going to lose the shadow detailing. And you want to go in with a thinner line on the edges, leave a little bit of space for a rim light, and then add in a heavier shadow shape. Like what I'm doing with this shoulder is leaving the spot in the middle open because I know I'm going to come in with a brush and just fill in that detail. Although if you wanted, you could leave a highlight in there. It might look kind of cool if you take it to colors, but I decided to make it a solid piece. Now, when rendering other textures, like I'm going to start working on his knee pad, uh, you have to think about what this piece feels like and what impression you want to give. In this case, it's armor. It's a much harder surface than his mask or the rest of the costume. And what I try to do is give jagged lines there, not the same as the texturing, but just giving it a harder edge. And in general, you want to vary your lines between smooth, graceful ones and harder, jagged ones, because it gives the eye a lot more to look at, more information to absorb, and it prevents your drawing from looking just too samey all over the place. Okay, now because I'm impatient, we're going to start filling in some of the black areas. Now, a lot of artists like to wait until the very end to fill in all the shadows, but as I said, I got very impatient. And what I'm using here is a brush tip marker. I believe it's the Copic variety, even though I'll probably color this piece in digitally. Now, what I'm doing here is adding the deepest shadow, uh, not actually on the bottom of the piece. I like to leave a bit of space, as I said, for rim lighting, and I just fill that in with the brush tip. But since it's inconsistent with the micron work of the rest of the piece, I go in with the microns and give it a new edge feathering, and I use a lot of hatching to give the piece a visual gray area uh, to work in. And in this case, I need a lot more detailing, so I go into a crosshatch, and I think that's looking pretty good. Now we're back to the thinnest pen, adding details to Deadpool's katana, and I like to use it this way because not only does it put the piece back in the drawing by using a thinner line, but also we can add as much detail as we want, and this helps to counterbalance the relatively light detailing work I did throughout the rest of the piece. Again, turn your paper as needed and continue to work, and even though this is time-lapsed, you can still see that I am working fairly slowly, getting the line just right. When I was first beginning inking, I rushed through the process because I thought, well, I just want to get to finished work. And my line weights were terrible, my shapes were not very good, and overall it was terribly amateur. So don't rush your work, no matter how excited you are. I had the pleasure of meeting Klaus Janson once at Comic Con, and he, when I asked for a bit of advice, told me that I have to remember every line tells a story, and so I am doing my best here to live up to that advice, and one of those things is deciding what story you want to tell. Every line that you render tells you something about a character or the character's environment. Now, adding details like additional marks or knocks onto his knee pads and armor lets you know that this character's been in battle, fought quite a bit, and Well, most likely one, or in the case of Deadpool, probably got blown to smithereens and came back for revenge. But when inking, always try to keep your mind your light source. And that's why I'm adding shadows on the underside of things, because I'm imagining a light coming from above. And the detail work and the lines that I'm placing here aren't just willy-nilly. I'm trying to tell you about the shape of the piece, suggest a rounded edge, and the jagged lines suggest a harder or rougher object. So like I did with the underside of his legs, just go in with your brush marker, see where you like those shapes to fall of the shadow, and then if you're not doing a brush piece and want it to have that micron look, go in and add micron style feathering. Now what I'm doing with this leg is outlining all the armor pieces on it first with a thicker micron to define the shape that I like. And then what I'm going to do is go in with smaller markers and start adding in feathering and all the more fun to do details, but I was cautioned that you can definitely over render a piece, and as fun as it is to go in and add this detail, you don't want every piece to be the star or the main focus, which is probably why I put the most time rendering out his eyes and the mask area around that, because we all want to see Deadpool's expression. And the shadows that I add shouldn't conflict with any shadows around, which is why I like leaving rim lights everywhere. You can always go in with a darker color to distract the eye from that, but trying to add color onto black would just be a giant hassle. Now, as I'm going to be using a roller to film the details and the shape of his gun, I did want his katanas to be bent and more curved, so that was intentional. I wasn't trying to BS anything. And just adding some shadows and some metal highlights by drawing the darkness around them and adding a shadow cast from the gun onto his hand, and that should be a completed Deadpool drawing. I'll be taking this to color soon. I'm still debating on colored pencil, Copic markers, or just going digital. And please tune in next week because I've got a really cool drawing. It's going to be Black Cat and Spider-Man from the Spider-Man 4 fan film I'm directing. Please like and subscribe and keep telling your stories.